"Wait a moment," said Judge Harrison, interrupting my brother in the middle of his dramatic opening about how our grandparents had been manipulated. His eyes fixed on me, sitting quietly at the defense table. "Aren't you Matthew Chin? The prosecutor who prosecuted the Morrison case last year?" My brother David's face drained of color. 15 minutes earlier, he had been painting a picture of me as a manipulative grandson who had isolated our grandparents from their real family to secure their inheritance. As if I were nothing more than a freeloader who had infiltrated the lives of two vulnerable elderly people. I stood up calmly. "Yes, Your Honor. Matthew Chun, Senior Prosecutor for the State Attorney General's Office." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. David looked at his lawyer with panic in his eyes. They had spent months preparing a strategy based on the premise that I was an unemployed failure living off my grandparents. My name is Matt, and at 32 years old, I just watched my older brother discover that he completely underestimated the wrong person. Throughout our childhood, David was the golden child. The athletic one, the charismatic one, the one who always got everything he wanted from our parents with a smile. Meanwhile, I was sent to live with our paternal grandparents at age 8 because I was too quiet and difficult to handle after the death of our younger sister. What my parents never understood was that Grandpa Chun and Grandma Margaret didn't see me as a burden. They saw me as a second chance to raise someone the right way. While David grew up spoiled, receiving new cars and trips to Europe from our parents, I grew up learning the value of hard work, integrity, and justice in nightly conversations with my retired grandfather. Grandpa had been a public defender for 40 years. Every night, he would tell me stories about how he defended people who had no one else. How he fought for the forgotten, the helpless. Those stories shaped who I became. David visited our grandparents exactly twice a year. Christmas and Grandpa's birthday. He always arrived empty-handed, always left with some loan that was never repaid. He always promised that next time he visited, he would stay longer. I was there every day. I helped Grandpa with his doctor's appointments when his health began to decline. I sat by Grandma's bedside during her final weeks. I was the one who arranged the funerals, who cleaned the house, who honored every wish they expressed. And when the will was read last week, David was shocked to discover that they had left everything to me. The house, the savings, even Grandpa's law school graduation ring. His reaction was not sadness or reflection on how he could have been a better grandson. It was pure anger. Within 72 hours, he had hired a lawyer and filed a lawsuit contesting the will. His claim was simple: I had manipulated two elderly people in a state of mental vulnerability to exclude the true heir of the family. As Judge Harrison leafed through my professional background on the computer, I could see David whispering frantically with his lawyer. They clearly hadn't done the basic homework of finding out who the person they were suing really was. If you're following this story and want to know how it ends, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next was something even I couldn't have predicted. Judge Harrison closed his laptop and looked directly at David. "Mr. Chun, your brother is one of the most respected prosecutors in this state. Someone who has dedicated his entire career to fighting exactly the kind of behavior you are alleging he committed." But what even the judge didn't know yet was that I had spent the last 3 years meticulously documenting every interaction David had with our grandparents. And that evidence would reveal a truth that would completely destroy the narrative he was trying to construct. The real manipulation was about to be exposed. And I wasn't the one behind it. The look on David's face changed from arrogant confidence to pure panic in a matter of seconds. He whispered something urgent to his lawyer, who began frantically leafing through his notes as if he could find some magical solution to the fact that he hadn't done the most basic research on who they were suing. But I knew my brother better than anyone else in that room. David had always been the kind of person who believed that charm and manipulation could replace preparation and hard work. That was exactly how he had operated our entire lives. When we were kids, David was 3 years older and used that as an excuse to have me do his homework while he played video games. When our parents questioned his poor grades, he blamed his teachers for picking on him. When he broke something in the house, there was always an explanation for how it wasn't his fault. At 16, David crashed Dad's car after a party. Instead of taking responsibility, he made up an elaborate story about how a drunk driver had hit him and fled the scene. Our parents believed him because David always knew exactly what to say to avoid consequences. It was around this time that I began to notice the pattern. David didn't just lie to avoid trouble, he lied because he genuinely believed he deserved to be protected from the consequences of his own actions. When I was sent to live with Grandpa Chun and Grandma Margaret at age 8, David was relieved. Less competition for our parents' attention. Less someone to question his versions of events. He could finally be the only child he always wanted to be. During my early years at my grandparents' house, David would visit me occasionally. Not out of longing or brotherly affection, but because Grandpa always gave him pocket money when he showed up. Even during these short visits, David managed to turn everything into drama. I clearly remember one Christmas when I was 10. David showed up the night before, unannounced, bringing a new girlfriend he wanted to impress. Grandpa had prepared a simple dinner, as he always did, but David complained loudly about the poor man's food in front of the girl. Grandma Margaret was hurt, but she didn't say anything. Grandpa Chun was furious, but he kept his composure for my sake. David left early, taking $200 he had borrowed from Grandpa and promising to visit more often. He didn't come back for 8 months. This was the pattern that had established itself over the years. David showed up when he needed something, money for a new car, help with a bill, or simply a place to impress a girlfriend with stories about our rich and influential grandfather. He never stuck around for the hard times. When Grandma Margaret started having health problems at 75, David was too busy with a new job to visit her in the hospital. When Grandpa Chun had his first heart surgery at 80, David was traveling for work and couldn't cancel. But I was there. I always was. I spent entire nights at the hospital holding Grandma's hand during her chemotherapy treatments. I took Grandpa to all his doctor's appointments when he became too weak to drive. I organized his medications, took care of the house, did the shopping. David would show up after the worst was over, always with an elaborate excuse and always managing to turn the situation into something about himself. "You don't know how hard it was for me to be away when you were sick," he would say, as if he were the real victim in the situation. What irritated me the most was how our grandparents always excused him. Grandpa Chun, a man who had dedicated his entire life to defending the helpless, who never tolerated injustice in his work, would simply sigh and say that David was still young and finding his way. Grandma Margaret, who taught me about responsibility and compassion through her own example, always defended David by saying that every person has their own way of showing love. But I saw the truth. David didn't love our grandparents. He saw them as a personal bank with familiar faces. At 22, David borrowed $10,000 to invest in a revolutionary business with a friend. The business went bankrupt in 6 months, and David never mentioned the money back. At 25, he needed $5,000 for a down payment on an apartment because he had been evicted for not paying rent. At 28, another $15,000 to pay off credit card debts that had gotten out of control. Grandpa Chun always gave him the money, but I saw how it affected him. He would be quiet for days afterward, staring out the window with a sad expression that broke my heart. One night when I was 26 and already established as a prosecutor, I found Grandpa sitting alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. He was staring at a checkbook with an expression of pure exhaustion. "Grandpa," I said softly, "are you okay?" He sighed deeply. "Matt, your brother called me today. He needs more money. $15,000 this time. He says it's an emergency." "And you're going to give it to him?" "He's my grandson," Grandpa replied, as if that explained everything. "I'm your grandson too," I said gently. "And I've never asked you for a penny." Grandpa looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen decades of injustice in the legal system. "You never had to ask, Matt. You've always been here. You've become the man I hoped you both would become." It was in that conversation that I understood something crucial about my grandfather. He didn't give David money because he believed in him. He gave it because he felt he had failed as a father figure in some way. Because David was a reflection of his biological parents, and Grandpa felt it was his responsibility to make up for that. But David interpreted this generosity as his birthright. When Grandma Margaret died 2 years ago, David showed up for the funeral wearing an expensive suit and driving a new car. He gave an emotional speech about how she had been the best grandmother in the world, and how he would miss the long conversations they used to have. Long conversations. David hadn't spent more than 2 hours straight in Grandma's presence in the last 5 years. After the funeral, while I was sorting through her belongings and comforting Grandpa Chun, David was in the backyard making work calls and complaining about having to waste a whole day on this. In the last year of Grandpa's life, when his health began to seriously decline, I called David several times trying to explain the gravity of the situation. He always promised to visit next week, or after he finished an important project. David showed up once in the last 6 months of Grandpa's life. He stayed for 40 minutes, borrowed $2,000 to cover some unexpected expenses, and left promising to come back soon. Grandpa Chun died 3 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was holding his hand. Grandma Margaret had died 2 years earlier, also with me by her side. David missed the funeral because he was in Las Vegas, closing an important deal. He arrived 2 days later, hungover and angry that he had missed the ceremony. It was when the will was read that I saw the real David emerge completely. "That's impossible," he said when the lawyer finished reading. "There must be a mistake. They can't have left everything to Matt. I'm the oldest son. I'm family." The irony was devastating. David, who had treated our grandparents like a personal bank for 2 decades, who had missed the most important moments of their lives, who had never shown genuine love or real care, was outraged that he had not been rewarded for his neglect. The lawyer patiently explained that the will was perfectly clear and legal. Grandpa Chun had left specific instructions, detailed documentation of his decisions, and even a letter explaining his reasons. David didn't want to hear the letter. Instead, he accused me of brainwashing a senile old man and manipulating the situation for my own personal gain. At that moment, watching my brother make a fuss about not receiving money from people he had systematically ignored, I made a decision. If David wanted a fight, I was prepared to give him exactly that. Because unlike him, I had paid attention all those years. I had documented everything. And when the time came to show who had really manipulated our grandparents, the evidence would be indisputable. David thought he knew the whole story. But he was about to find out that I had learned much more than law and justice during my years as a prosecutor. I had learned how to build unassailable cases against people who thought they were above the consequences. David left the courtroom that first day with an expression I knew all too well. It was the same look he had when our parents canceled a punishment or when he managed to convince Grandpa to lend him more money. The expression of someone who believes they can still manipulate the situation to their advantage. But this time, he had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. In the 3 days following our first meeting in court, David launched a systematic campaign to destroy my reputation. He began by calling every member of our extended family, telling a distorted version of the facts in which I was the manipulative villain who had taken advantage of senile grandparents. Aunt Margaret, Grandpa Chen's younger sister, called me in tears on Thursday. "Matt, David told me about the will," she said, her voice trembling. "He said you forbade our parents from seeing us in recent years. That you controlled their access to visits and phone calls." I took a deep breath, holding back the anger boiling in my chest. "Aunt Margaret, how many times have you visited Grandpa and Grandma in the last 5 years?" Awkward silence on the other end of the line. Well, you know how hard it is to travel from Chicago to here, and—" "0 times, I said calmly. "You visited 0 times. David too. The only difference is that he's trying to rewrite history now that there's money involved." But the damage was done. David had planted seeds of doubt in an already distant family, creating a narrative where he was the wronged victim and I was the calculating manipulator. His strategy got even dirtier when he started showing up at my workplace. On Friday, I got a call from the reception desk at the district attorney's office. "Mr. Chun, there's a David Chun downstairs claiming to be your brother. He's being quite insistent on speaking with you." I went down to meet David in the lobby, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Grandpa Chun earned in a month when he retired. He was surrounded by 3 co-workers, gesturing dramatically as he told his side of the story. "Matt," he yelled when he saw me, loud enough for half the lobby to hear. "I'm trying to have a civil conversation about our grandparents' estate, but you're avoiding me." I approached calmly. "David, you have a lawyer. If you want to discuss the case, do so through the appropriate channels." "Oh, so now you're the family legal expert," he said, his voice thick with disdain. "Funny how you never mentioned your profession when we were kids. I wonder if our grandparents knew what a manipulative grandson they were raising." I felt the curious glances of my colleagues. David was deliberately creating a public spectacle, trying to humiliate me in my workplace. "David," I said quietly, "you have 30 seconds to leave this building before I call security." He laughed loudly, a fake, theatrical laugh. "Threats now? Look at that, everyone. This is the man who convinced 2 elderly people to leave everything to him. Impeccable character, don't you think? It was at that moment that Sarah Kim, my colleague from the Financial Crimes Division of the prosecutor's office, approached. Sarah had worked with me on several fraud cases and knew exactly the kind of person I was. "Excuse me," she said, her voice as sharp as ice. "Sir, you are disrupting a work environment and making unfounded accusations against one of the most respected prosecutors in this state. I suggest you leave before this becomes an official incident." David looked at Sarah, then at me, calculating his options. He realized he had lost control of the situation. "This isn't over, Matt," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. "I'm going to prove that you manipulated our grandparents. And when I do, you're going to lose everything." He left, but left behind an atmosphere thick with whispers and curious glances. Sarah pulled me aside. "Matt, what the hell was that?" I quickly explained the situation: the will, the lawsuit, David's attempt to paint me as the villain. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "Your brother has no idea who you are, does he?" "He sees me as the same 8-year-old boy who was sent away," I replied. "He never bothered to find out who I became." "Well," Sarah said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "he's about to find out. If you need anything, character witnesses, professional references, whatever, you know you can count on me." But David didn't stop there. The following week, he escalated his tactics to a level that took me completely by surprise. I got a call from Jennifer Walsh, my ex-girlfriend from 3 years ago. We hadn't spoken since our amicable breakup, when she moved to Seattle for work. "Matt, sorry to call out of the blue," she said, sounding confused. "But someone named David Chun contacted me on LinkedIn saying he's your brother. He's asking strange questions about our relationship, about your personality, whether you've ever shown controlling or manipulative tendencies." My blood ran cold. Did he specifically say that? Not in those words, but the questions were along those lines. "Matt, what's going on?" He said something about a lawsuit and that he needs people to testify about your true character. It sounded very suspicious. David was trying to build a personal case against me, looking for ex-girlfriends, former college classmates, anyone who might have something negative to say about me. The problem for him was that my personal and professional life had always been conducted with the same integrity that Grandpa Chun had taught me. He wouldn't find the bombshells he was looking for. But the fact that he was digging so deep, invading aspects of my life that had nothing to do with the will, showed me something fundamental about David's character that I had underestimated. He wasn't just fighting for the money. He was genuinely furious that he had been rejected by my grandparents in favor of me. It had hurt his ego deeply, and now he wanted not only to win the inheritance, but to destroy me completely in the process. It was on Sunday night, exactly 1 week after that first meeting in court, that I made a fundamental decision. I was sitting in the living room of my grandparents' house, my home now, looking at the photographs on the walls. Decades of memories: Grandpa and me playing chess, Grandma and me in the garden, graduations, birthdays, simple moments of a family that truly loved each other. David didn't appear often in any of these photos. When he did, he was clearly uncomfortable, looking away or checking his phone. I picked up my laptop and started doing something I should have done years ago. I began to systematically document the entire relationship between David and our grandparents. Not just memories, but concrete evidence. Bank statements showing all the loans Grandpa had given David over the years. Emails from David asking for money. Text messages canceling visits at the last minute. Generic birthday cards that arrived weeks late. As I organized this evidence, a clear picture emerged. David hadn't been a negligent grandson by accident or circumstance. He had made deliberate and consistent choices to prioritize his own convenience over our grandparents. And now, he wanted to be rewarded for those choices. I closed my laptop at 3 in the morning, but my mind was made up. David wanted a war? He would get a war. But it would be fought on my terms, by my rules, using the tools I had honed over a decade as a prosecutor. He had spent his entire life underestimating the people around him, believing that charm and manipulation were enough to get him what he wanted. This time, he had picked the wrong target. And when I finished building my case against him, David would finally understand the difference between a frightened 8-year-old boy and a 32-year-old man who had dedicated his entire career to exposing liars and manipulators. The next hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from now. David would probably spend that time looking for more people to smear my character and building fantasies about how he would humiliate his manipulative brother in court. But I would spend those 2 weeks doing what I do best, building a meticulous, irrefutable, and devastating case. David wanted to find out who I had really become after I left his life. He was about to find out in the worst possible way. The next 2 weeks turned into a masterclass on how to build a criminal case, except this time I was the defendant, not the prosecutor. I spent the first 3 days organizing all the documentation I had collected on David over the years. Not just the obvious evidence, bank statements, emails, messages, but also the subtle stuff. Photographs of family events where David was clearly uncomfortable or absent. Generic birthday cards that arrived weeks late. Phone records showing that he only contacted our grandparents when he needed something. But David, in his growing arrogance, was handing me fresh evidence almost daily. On Tuesday, he showed up at my grandparents' house, my house now, unannounced. I was in the office organizing documents when I heard the sound of the front door lock being tampered with. "Matt," his voice echoed through the house. "I know you're here. We need to talk like brothers." I went downstairs to find him standing in the living room, analyzing the furniture as if he were assessing the value of each piece. "David," I said calmly, "you don't live here anymore. You can't just walk in." He laughed, that fake laugh I knew so well. "Relax, little brother. This house is still as much mine as it is yours, at least until the court decides who really deserves to inherit what our grandparents built." He walked over to the bookcase where Grandpa Chin kept his law books and awards. He picked up one of the commemorative plaques, examining it as if it were an item at auction. "You know," he continued without looking at me, "I've been talking to some people about you. People from your school, former teachers, ex-girlfriends. It seems you've always been the type who liked to control situations, even as a child." My blood ran cold, but I kept my expression neutral. "What are you trying to say, David?" "I'm saying that maybe you learned how to manipulate our grandparents from a very young age. Maybe you spent all these years building an image of the perfect grandson specifically for this moment." He put the plaque back on the shelf and turned to face me. "Have you ever thought about that, Matt? How will it sound in court when my lawyer shows that you've always been calculating? That every Sunday dinner, every favor you did, every moment you spent here was part of a long-term plan?" The irony was almost comical. David was accusing me of doing exactly what he was trying to do now, manipulating a narrative to gain something he didn't deserve. "David," I said slowly, "do you really believe that? That an 8-year-old boy would have the capacity to orchestrate a 24-year manipulation plan?" "Smart people are capable of surprising things," he replied with a cruel smile. "And you've always been the smart one in the family, haven't you? The one who achieved a brilliant career, a promising future. Now I understand how." He walked past me toward the door, but stopped halfway. "Oh, and Matt? You can start looking for another place to live. When I win this case, I want my house back, and fast." After he left, I stood in the room for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. David wasn't just building a legal case against me. He was trying to completely rewrite our family history, turning decades of his own neglect into evidence of my alleged manipulation. But what he didn't realize was that his visit had been a gift. Every word he said, every accusation he made, every attempt at intimidation would be documented and used to demonstrate exactly the kind of person he really was. I called my attorney, Thomas Richardson, the next morning. "Thomas, I need you to hire a private investigator. Someone discreet but thorough." "Sure, Matt. What are you looking for?" "David's complete financial history for the last 10 years. Employment records, legal proceedings, business relationships. I want to know every dollar he's earned, every debt he's incurred, every promise he's broken." That could get expensive. "Thomas, they're trying to prove that I manipulated 2 vulnerable elderly people to steal an inheritance. I'm willing to spend whatever it takes to show who really deserves to be on trial here." If you're following this journey of how David completely underestimated who I've become, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see how this legal battle unfolds. Meanwhile, David was growing increasingly confident. On Thursday, I received a call from Jessica Chun, our second cousin who lives in Los Angeles. "Matt, sorry to call, but David reached out to me. He's saying that you're trying to steal your uncle's inheritance and that the family should unite against you." And what did you say to him, Jessica? Well, he sounded very convincing. He said that you've always been manipulative, that you isolated our grandparents from the family. He said he has evidence that you pressured them to change their will. My heart sank. Jessica barely knew our family history, and David was exploiting that ignorance to construct a narrative where he was the wronged victim. Jessica, when was the last time you visited Grandpa Chun and Grandma Margaret? Awkward silence. Well, you know how difficult it is to travel from Los Angeles, and… Never, I said gently. You never visited them. Neither did David. The difference is that now there's money involved, and he's trying to rewrite history. But he said you forbade visits, that you controlled who they could see. Jessica, our grandparents had a phone. They had email. If they wanted to talk to the family, they could have called. But you never called back. I hung up the phone with a mixture of sadness and determination. David was systematically poisoning our extended family against me, planting seeds of doubt about my character and creating a network of witnesses who would support his version of events. But every call like this gave me more evidence of his pattern of behavior. David always did this. When he was losing an argument or facing consequences, he would shift the focus to victimizing himself and demonizing others. On Friday, I received the first report from the private investigator. David Chun had worked at 9 different jobs in the last 10 years. He had been fired from 5 of them for violations of company policy or misconduct. He had filed for personal bankruptcy twice. He had 3 lawsuits pending in court for unpaid debts. Even more interesting, he had received exactly $43,200 from Grandpa Chun over the past 5 years. These were not loans, as he claimed. They were direct transfers, always preceded by dramatic emails about financial emergencies or missed opportunities. There had never been a single payment back. The report also included interviews with former co-workers. The description that emerged was of someone who blamed others for his failures, who promised results he never delivered, and who had a pattern of manipulative behavior in professional relationships. On Sunday night, exactly 1 week before the next hearing, I sat at the same kitchen table where I used to do homework with Grandpa Chun. I spread all the documents out in front of me: financial evidence, communication records, witness statements, a detailed chronology of events. The case against David wasn't just solid. It was devastating. He had spent 2 decades treating our grandparents like his personal bank. He had been absent for every important moment in their lives. He had demonstrated a consistent pattern of financial and professional irresponsibility. And now, he was trying to rewrite that history of neglect as if he were a victim of manipulation. But what struck me most was how David continued to underestimate my abilities. He thought he was dealing with the same shy boy who had been sent away at age 8. He didn't realize that this boy had grown up to be someone who spent his days building cases against people just like him. People who lied to avoid consequences. People who manipulated narratives to benefit themselves. People who thought charm and victimization were adequate substitutes for responsibility and character. I closed the document folder and looked around the kitchen where Grandpa Chun had taught me about justice, integrity, and the importance of always telling the truth. David wanted a legal war? He would have one. But it would be fought with evidence, not manipulation. With facts, not fabricated narratives. With a meticulous methodology I had perfected over a decade of courtroom experience. The next hearing would be in a week. David would likely spend that time trying to gather more witnesses to support his version of events and devising strategies to paint me as the villain of the story. I would spend that time doing what I always did, preparing a case based on irrefutable evidence and documented truth. And when the time came to present that evidence in court, David would finally discover who I had really become after I left his life. The countdown had begun. The second hearing began exactly as David had planned. His lawyer Palmer presented a parade of witnesses that David had recruited: distant cousins, former schoolmates, even Jennifer, my ex-girlfriend, whom he had managed to convince to testify about my alleged controlling behavior. Palmer constructed an elaborate narrative about how I had systematically manipulated our elderly grandparents, isolating them from the family and creating emotional dependency to secure the inheritance. David sat at the plaintiff's table with a confident smile. He genuinely believed he had built a solid case against me. It was when Thomas stood up for our defense that David's expression began to change. "Your Honor," Thomas said calmly, "before we present our defense, I would like to play an audio recording." Palmer immediately stood up. Objection. We were not informed of any recording. Your Honor, Thomas replied, this recording was made legally by the plaintiff himself during his unauthorized visit to Mr. Chen's home last week. My heart raced. Thomas had recorded David's conversation at my house? How? Permission granted, Judge Harrison said. David's voice echoed through the courtroom. You know, I've been talking to some people about you. It seems you've always been the type who liked to control situations, even as a child. Perhaps you learned to manipulate our grandparents from a very young age. Every poisonous word David had spoken, every attempt at intimidation, every admission that he was deliberately building a false case against me was being played back for the entire court to hear. David's face turned white as a sheet. Furthermore, Thomas continued, projecting documents onto the screen, we have here complete bank records showing that Mr. David Chun received $43,200 from the deceased over the past 5 years. Not loans, as he claimed, but direct transfers that were never repaid. Palmer whispered something frantically in David's ear, but my brother seemed to be in a state of total shock. And finally, Thomas said, turning directly to David, I would like to ask the plaintiff when he last visited his grandparents before their death. David was silent. For the record, Thomas continued, it was 8 months ago. A 30-minute visit where he borrowed $2,000 and left without properly saying goodbye. Judge Harrison looked directly at David. Mr. Chun, do you have anything to say in your defense? David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in his life, his manipulation skills had completely failed. It was at that moment that I realized he finally understood who he was dealing with. The 8-year-old boy he remembered had become the man who now held all the cards. The revenge Grandpa Chun taught me wasn't about destruction. It was about justice. And justice was about to be served. The verdict was unanimous and devastating for David. After reviewing all the evidence presented, Judge Harrison declared, this court finds that Chun Williams will perfectly reflect his conscious and well-informed intentions. The lawsuit is completely without merit. David slumped in his chair as if he had been punched in the stomach. Furthermore, the judge continued, considering the deliberate attempts to manipulate witnesses and build a case based on false allegations, I order Mr. David Chun to pay all court costs and attorney's fees for the defendant. Palmer whispered something frantically in David's ear, but my brother seemed to be in a state of complete shock. $43,000 in unpaid loans. 8 months without visiting our dying grandparents. Decades of documented neglect. And now, another $15,000 in legal fees. As we left the courthouse, David finally found his voice. Matt, wait, he called to me in the parking lot, his previous arrogance completely evaporated. Maybe we can talk about this. Split the inheritance 50-50, like brothers should. I stopped and turned to face him. For the first time in decades, I saw David genuinely vulnerable, without his usual masks of charm or manipulation. David, I said calmly, you had 32 years to be my brother. You had your whole life to show love for our grandparents. You chose to do neither. But we're family, he insisted, using the same word he had rejected throughout our childhood. Family isn't who you share your DNA with, I replied. It's who shows up when you need them. Who stands by you in tough times. Who chooses you every day, not just when there's money involved. Grandpa Chun and Grandma Margaret taught me that. They chose me when my own parents sent me away. They loved me when you ignored me. They invested in who I could become, not who I was convenient to be. David was silent, finally confronted with decades of his own choices. Money was just paper to them, I continued. What they really left me was much more valuable. Integrity. Purpose. The understanding that real love is demonstrated through actions, not words. I walked toward my car, but turned around one last time. They waited until the last day of their lives for you to show up, David. To call. To show genuine interest in them as people, not as a source of money. You never did that. 6 months later, I used part of the inheritance to establish a foundation in my grandparents' name. Scholarships for law students from low-income families. Exactly the kind of cause Grandpa Chun would have supported. David tried to contact me a few times through emails and messages, always with the same theme, family reconciliation and making amends. I never responded. Some bridges, when burned by decades of neglect, cannot be rebuilt just because someone finally realized their value. I heard through distant cousins that he moved to another state, started a new job, and tried to start over far from the shadow of his public humiliation. Part of me hopes he learned something from the whole experience. But the truth is, David was never really my brother. He was just someone who shared my family tree but never chose to share my life. Grandpa Chen and Grandma Margaret taught me that true family is built through consistent presence, unconditional love, and daily choices to prioritize one another. They gave me a home when I didn't have one. They gave me love when I didn't know I deserved it. They gave me a future when mine seemed uncertain. The financial inheritance was just the outward reflection of a much deeper inheritance, the understanding that we deserve to be loved for who we are, not for who it is convenient to love. The night after the verdict, I sat in the same kitchen where Grandpa Chen taught me about justice and integrity. I looked at the photographs on the walls, decades of genuine memories, real love, true family. David thought he could rewrite our story in court. He thought he could use charm and manipulation to steal something he never had a right to possess. But some things cannot be stolen. Genuine love. Memories built through consistent presence. Legacies built through character. If you've come this far on this journey about true versus biological family, subscribe to the channel for more stories about how justice always finds its way, even when it seems like the manipulators are winning. The last I heard from David, he was working in sales in a small town, far from everything he knew. Me? Well, I was opening the Chen Foundation's 5th reading room in public schools, perpetuating the legacy of people who understood that true love multiplies when it is shared. And every night before I go to sleep, I give thanks for being raised by people who taught me the difference between biological family and chosen family. Because in the end, David may have been born my brother. But Grandpa Chen and Grandma Margaret chose to be my parents. And that difference made all the difference in the world.